On today's episode, I'm talking with Jake Lee from the Pennsylvania Health Law Project. In Pennsylvania, there are 3.5 million people on Medicaid. That's a lot of money. We talk about how to address those costs and what the future looks like for legislation within the healthcare space. Everybody wants to talk, but nobody wants to listen. So here's my petition. Instead of division, let's make our mission to change the system. Learn how the world works. Learn how we can act. Welcome, everybody, to the Justice Podcast. Jake, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast today. Before we really jump into the substance of the interview, which is going to be talking about accessibility and costs of healthcare, I would love if you could introduce yourself to the audience and tell us a little bit about what PHLP is.
Sure. Thanks, Bobby. My name is Jake Lee. I'm an attorney with the Pennsylvania Health Law Project. I'm based out of our Pittsburgh office. We have two main offices, one in Pittsburgh and one in Philadelphia, but we serve the whole state in Pennsylvania. We previously had an office in Harrisburg that is no longer existing because we're working from home, but we do assist all Pennsylvanians with Medicaid issues. So our entire firm it's pro bono legal services. Nobody pays for our services. We help people on Medicaid or people trying to get on Medicaid, people terminated from Medicaid, all pretty much based around that. We don't do as much with Medicare, but a lot of our clients have both Medicaid and Medicare. So we do know how they work together. We also do a lot of services. If somebody is on Medicaid and their Medicaid provider is denying them a service, we get involved with that. And depending on the case, we either personally represent or give advice depending on our bandwidth.
For those who don't know, can you explain the difference between Medicare and Medicaid?
Sure. So Medicare is a federally funded program, and it's usually for people over 65, but there are caveats to that. Some people have Medicare due to being on Social Security disability for longer than 3 years. But mostly when we're talking about Medicare, we're talking about older Americans through a federally funded, and it's a red, white, and blue card. And then Medicaid is a state by state, and each state sets their own limits, income based. Medicaid is mainly for lower income populations. It's a state fund. Well, they get money from the federal government, but it's run by the states, and it's based usually on income and resources.
So then your clientele is normally going to be lower income. What kind of barriers does that create when they're trying to access your services?
So one of the main issues is, like a lot of businesses during the COVID-19 pandemic, is we've gone fully remote. But we do still have physical offices. And if people need to come into a physical office, if they don't have access to technology, we do make accommodations for that. But through our process here is our contact information is on the denial notices for Medicaid. So they can call us based on those denial notices. And if it's something we do, we'll set up an intake and we'll transfer it to a case handler. That's normally how people get involved, although we do have a lot of repeat clients who we have helped in the past and they just get back in touch with us. But one of our main drivers is that on every denial notice for Medicaid, there's the Pennsylvania Health Law Project's number.
So you said people are sometimes repeat clients. Why would that be the case?
So a lot of people have ongoing issues. What we're seeing a lot during the pandemic is people who have home health care, and that is through a Medicaid service called the waiver program. And that means that they get that Medicaid pays for an aide to come in there to help them with their activities of daily living and other things that's like they're not able to do themselves. And the amount of hours they get are determined by the insurance company who is running the Medicaid. And that does not always match up with what the client or the client's doctors think they need. So that's a big barrier we're seeing where people have, like, let's just hypothetically say somebody has 24 hours of care. They get a new assessment from the insurance company and they're cut in half, but with no change in their health. So that is where we come in, and that is where we're kind of, maybe not a thorn in the side of these Medicaid insurance companies, but we definitely try to, keep them on the up and up.
So in acting as a thorn or not a thorn, does that mean you go straight to a lawsuit, or are you advocating in other ways? How does that work?
So normally with all Medicaid denials, whether it's what I was talking about, home and community-based services, or a denial for a wheelchair or some other sort of durable medical equipment that's covered by Medicaid, that person will get appeal rights, and there are levels to that appeal. And if you'd like, I can discuss them briefly, but what we do is we normally stay within that appeal framework, which starts with an appeal to the insurance company, where they get to kind of police themselves and see if they made a mistake, which is not always successful because you're asking them to admit they made a mistake. And then following that one, if that's not successful, there's two other levels of appeal. One is to an external review agency, so an agency that's just set up to review insurance denial appeals. They go by a lot of different names. There's a lot of different companies that do them, but that's the one level. And then the level above that is to a fair hearing, which is in front of an administrative law judge. And that's normally where we were personally representing, because it's the first legal proceeding that comes with this denial. So that's normally in the framework that we work in for these people who are been denied. We have been, we also do a lot of policy work with the state and try to stop these issues before we have to appeal them.
So what does that policy work look like?
So every week, the PHLP, which Pennsylvania Health Law Project, if I use that acronym, we meet with the Office of Long-Term Living to discuss implementation of programs across the state. Normally, and I don't want to get too in depth to just what's specific here in Pennsylvania, but back in 2018, the state allowed a switch to managed care for dual eligible populations, and I'll get into what that means. So managed care means that the state no longer runs our Medicaid system for most people. It's run by insurance companies who are paid for. The state pays the insurance company a capitated rate, and the insurance company then is the gatekeeper to the services that people need, rather than the state being the gatekeeper as it was prior to 2018. So that's kind of where we're at on that. And I hold on, I'm thinking that I may have lost track of where we were at, but I got Chuck on the SDHC plans. But the managed care that's where the switch came in. So we meet with the Office of Long-Term Living, who oversees all of those plans weekly, bi-weekly now, to discuss the issues that we're seeing that are coming to our helpline, that we're hearing from participants in the plans. And we try to see if there are patterns or something that we can see that this is going on, and we're asking you to fix it. Other than us doing it through a litigation, it's through a policy advocacy with the director of the Office of Long-Term Living.
So it seems like there might be a conflict of interest within that system if the insurance company is approving procedures, but they're also the ones who are paying.
Yes. Yeah. Conflict of interest is a tough word to use, but what the selling point was for the state was that these insurance companies who do this with private, people who have private insurance, right? And when I'm at in the western part of the state, a big one is UPMC. You can get that through your employer, and it's the same thing. So what the selling point for the state was that these insurance companies already do this for people who are not on Medicaid. And so they can run this more efficient than the state can because they already have these systems in place. So they're just growing the systems that they already have in place, was kind of the selling point for CHC in 2018.
And so when PHLP is evaluating different policies to pursue or advocate for, how do you prioritize, or how do you select these different things?
So normally what we do is we have a meeting internally every weekly to, again, discuss what we're seeing. So how organization is kind of set up is there's a large, well, by large, I mean, we're only 16 people as an organization. So, but most of us handle individual cases, like myself. So we get cases assigned to us through our helpline. People call in. If it's something that we can help with, our director of intake sets up an intake, talks to them for about a half hour, gets all this information, and then sends it to a case handler. And the case handler then reaches out to the participant. And what we try to do is we try to see what's going on, because we're not in Medicaid, we're not the ones seeing these issues pop up. These people who are and getting these denial notices, like if we're seeing a pattern through one managed care organization, one insurance company, that's where we prioritize first. Like, is this something that can wait till the call that we have in 2 weeks? Or is this something that we are seeing now and we need to get, and like, we need to fix this now? So that's kind of how we kind of keep our finger on the pulse of what's going on. We also have, there's community organizations and community groups that are called upon, and they meet once every couple months, and we listen on those calls to see what they're, talking about to the insurance companies. But we just try to kind of be the voice of the people who are on Medicaid, who they don't know how to fix these issues, and sometimes we don't either. So we're trying to identify them as they come and brainstorm what can be done to fix them.
So roughly how many clients do you serve in a year?
Myself or PHLP? Because it depends. Usually at any time I have active 35 to 50 cases active. And we're encouraged by our great compliance person to close them when we can. That doesn't always happen. But I believe in the last year, PHLP was at around 1,500 cases. And those range to what we're doing. Sometimes they're just calling for advice, and we can, help that client with what they need with one call, just talking to us. Other times it's more in depth and can lead to personal representation. But that it depends. We do all kind of levels of that, and we advise or we represent, just depending on what their issue is.
When you went off to law school, is this what you imagined you would be doing, or did you have a totally different idea about your career?
I had a very different idea about my career. When I went to law school, I was in the family law clinic and thought I wanted to do private family law. And then I assisted in that. I was a law clerk for a family law judge in Indiana County, PA. And I saw how terrible and vicious family law can be. And it kind of I don't want to say broke me, but it made me open my horizons a little bit. And I knew that I wanted to litigate. So that's, family law is one where you can litigate all the time. They're making you go to court all the time. But I kind of changed that. And for 3 years prior to working at PHLP, which I started at the end of 2019, I was a parent advocate attorney. So I represented parents in Allegheny County who had their children taken away by CYF. So I did not plan to be a health law attorney, as the short answer, but I do really enjoy the direct client work that we do. Sometimes it almost feels like we're half attorney, half social worker, but the social workers on our roster would be happy to hear me say that. So.
Do you have any particular win or story that you're proud of?
I don't it's weird for me to toot my own horn. I mean, so what we do actually is at PHLP is we have a weekly thing where people post their wins, and they send them to our director of intake, and she sends an email around just to keep everybody's spirits up. Because sometimes, dealing with these insurance companies and dealing with state agencies like the county assistance office, and some the people are overwhelmed. It's a lot of work. So it can get a little demoralizing sometimes. The one I like to think about is at the beginning of COVID-19. I had a client who was 94 years old. She was in the advanced stages of dementia. And there's a law that prohibits somebody's power of attorney from being their home health aide because of, I'm sure you can imagine, there could be abuse situations in that scenario. But this was the beginning of COVID. this woman had severe dementia. She did not know where she was. She would have severe outbursts if she was around anyone other than her daughter, who happened to be her POA. So I was able to gather all this information, write this report, take it directly to the leader of the Office of Long-Term Living, and we got her a waiver. And unfortunately, this client passed away about 3 months later. But for those 3 months, she was allowed to stay home with her daughter, the only person that like she remembered, instead of putting her through this. Well, and don't get me wrong, Bobby, I completely understand why that protection is in place, but this was not what it was designed to protect. So being able to help people in these different situations, like that's not a situation we see very often, makes it kind of worthwhile.
Wow, that's powerful. And it kind of brings up an issue that comes up in policy in general, is the idea that laws are written one way, and then when they're applied, they come upon scenarios that they just were not designed to handle. How can legislators approach healthcare laws in like, I don't know, are there any general principles that you think somebody should approach if they're writing a healthcare laws? And I know this is a very broad question.
Sure, yeah, but it's an important one, I believe.
Yeah, how can they do that?
I think it's most important to talk to the people. Senator Casey's office in Pennsylvania has reached out to us multiple times to get kind of like a finger on the pulse of what's going on with the people who are in these waiver programs and why the people that are getting the in-home help. So the waiver program in Pennsylvania was kind of set up to keep people out of nursing homes. And that never became more important than during COVID, right? You had these people who were already immune compromised, already elderly. They should not have been around, prior to vaccines, even, before that. So the most important thing is to listen. There's a big push right now for person-centered planning, and that you can't take care of all these people with broad strokes of a pen. Like writing one statute is not going to cover everybody's situation in Pennsylvania or countrywide. So I think that the more individual based we can get and base these plans and people's care around their individual needs is the best way to do it. And I think the only way to do that is to take time and to listen to people who are dealing with these programs that you're writing, that you're putting into place. Because once you put into place and it sounds great on paper, right? Like the power of attorney thing, like it just doesn't work all the time.
And in building out these person-centered plans, does that start with insurance? Does that start with policy? Who initiates that?
So right now, how it's set up is usually, and this is specifically to the waiver program because this is where we're dealing with the most, but like a service coordinator is supposed to come out, and a service coordinator is usually directly employed by the insurance company. But their whole job as a service coordinator is supposed to be to help these people who are obviously in a weakened, ill state. To even be on the waiver program, normally you need to be like nursing facility clinically eligible, which means that you would be in a nursing facility without this care. So what we're looking for in that program, and where the person-centered has made a big push, is that these service coordinators are supposed to come out to the home, in-person assessments that are supposed to last 3 hours, even more if needed. And they're supposed to get an entire view of what's going on in this person's life. They're not supposed to just interview the person. They're supposed to interview their home health aides if they already have them, or family members if they don't, or anybody that's involved and cares about this person is invited and encouraged to be there. On paper, sounds great, right? But right now, like during COVID, obviously those assessments were pushed to phone, and they're just coming back now to get more in person, but we're still seeing some reluctance, and we're seeing, like, we'll get logs from the insurance company, and sometimes these assessments are taking 10 minutes, and that's not what they're supposed to be. So we're doing our push, and we've been yelling at the Office of Long-Term Living, and they've been they've been receptive of it, to that we need to push that these go back into person because they're missing a lot. So that's the one thing that comes out to me about an issue with that. And I mean, we can always do better, but I think that's the best place to start right now.
So talking about PHLP, why do you feel like PHLP is good? I mean, you've talked about some of the other kind of reasons it's good, but just why is it filling a niche, and how does it compare with other ways of trying to reform healthcare?
So I think that we are unique in the fact that we deal only with Medicaid. I mean, there are legal aid programs across the state of Pennsylvania. I actually went to the Pennsylvania Legal Aid Network conference in September, and I got to meet a lot more people who are in these local legal aids, and they have enough to deal with, right? They have SNAP, they have family law, they have all these landlord tenants, a huge one for them. Like, they have a lot of issues that are only exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So with Medicaid right now, PHLP is in a spot to help identify these issues, and try to attack them not only on a case handler standpoint, as I do, like personally representing people, but on a policy base, that these issues we're seeing right now, if we can stop them from going to these local legal aids or having to do this on their own, like stop it before it becomes an issue, I think that's what we are best at. And to do that on a larger point, we can definitely, like, I don't want to like put it as like a metaphor here, but like kind of like the 300 Spartans as stop the floodgates there in Thermopylae, kind of like that. Is like there's not very many of us, but what we can do, if we can do this from a policy standpoint, is we can affect, and there's over 3.5 million people in Pennsylvania on Medicaid. So that is more than a fourth of the population of Pennsylvania is on Medicaid, which is huge, right? So as a legal organization that only deals with that, we're in a very unique point to help punch above our weight class, I guess would be the way to say it. So that's kind of what I think. And right now, we're lucky that we're still in the public health emergency, the federal one. So Medicaid can't be stopped for people. However, that's likely to end in January. So we are expecting a flood of issues, and we're trying our best to get ahead of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we've kind of danced around is the cost of all of this. How does someone even think about how much money all of these different things cost?
I mean, healthcare itself is an astronomical cost. I mean, we're not going to like dance around the fact that Medicaid is an expensive program, and it's matched federally. And you'll see that there are multiple discussions throughout the legislature about cutting Medicaid or going back. Since 2015, when it was expanded under the Affordable Care Act, the numbers on Medicaid like tripled, right? So why is it important that these people who otherwise wouldn't be are covered through Medicaid? I always think of it this way: is there is always going to be a high upfront cost when it comes to healthcare, but the back end of it is worse, right? If you have people that don't have any health insurance, they're going to get sicker and sicker without the proper medical care. And when it becomes an emergency, hopefully they make it to the hospital, and those bills are not going to be paid. They're not only going to ruin that person's livelihood, credit score, etc., but there's just outstanding bills there that get passed on anyways, and they're astronomical. And then when it comes to, but it didn't have to get that far, right? If they were getting proper medical care to begin with, and they're not afraid to go to the doctors because they can't afford a $200 doctor visit, right? So I always think the preventative care that through Medicaid and those upfront costs that we're splitting, like, it's partly state dollars, partly federal dollars, where the money comes from doesn't really matter. It's when you look at it, it's kind of takes your breath away. But if you think about it the other way, the cost of not doing it is worse.
Yeah. So kind of to synthesize what you were saying is essentially it's one, if not paying for it now kicks the can down the road, and likely it's a lot bigger of a can once we get there.
Right, exactly. And that can's going to need to be paid anyways. Weird thing to say, that can needs to be paid, right? But that bill is going to be there. And whoever that gets passed on, like hospitals in emergency situation are not allowed to deny care. Like they're just not allowed to do it. But what happens when that person just can't pay it? That bill has to go somewhere. And then we're forcing people to wait till in this emergency situation to go to a hospital that they can't afford anyways. And now it's ruined their lives, and then that bill still gets passed on.
So maybe to wrap up our conversation, what are you most excited about in the future of healthcare?
I've always been a big proponent of that mental health care is as important as physical health care. So I'm excited for what I've seen is, especially in younger people these days, is a more acceptance of that mental health is such a big priority. And if more people through Medicaid or through, private insurance companies through your employer, the coverage of mental health care is expanding. And I'm hoping that through mental health care as well as physical health care, I mean, we have an aging population at this time that is going to need to be taken care of. And there's going to be a lot of hurdles coming up, and how much in-home versus nursing home, that's something I'm not looking forward to. But when it comes to something I am looking forward to is just this acceptance that mental health is healthcare, and that you can get proper mental health care before, again, not to use the same analogy, but before that can gets too big for you to handle. And before something happens, now that we've had this acceptance of like that, I personally believe, and I tell anybody who will listen to this, that I think every person in the world needs therapy, right? And so I think that if people are more accepting of that and insurance covers it, that people are going to be getting the mental health care they need, and they're going to be living an overall healthier lifestyle.
Well, Jake, I really appreciate your time. I've learned a lot in this, and I think the listeners will get a lot out of this conversation. So I appreciate it.
I really appreciate the time, Bobby. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Have a good
See
one.
ya.
This isn't financial, legal, or medical advice, but we do discuss how we might invest our resources for a healthier society. If you'd like to learn more about today's topic and other public policy issues, check out the website, thejusticepodcast.com.